There are many theories regarding when and where music originated. Many agree that music began even before man existed. Historiographers point out that there are 6 periods of music, and each period has a particular style that greatly contributed to what music is today. The second half of the 16th century witnessed the beginnings of the tradition which many music lovers readily associate with the normal feel of classical music. This was also something of a golden period for choral composition, as a seemingly endless flow of a cappella masses, motets, anthems, psalms and madrigals flowed from the pens of the masters of the age. For many people, Beethoven is the greatest composer who ever lived. His music reveals a titanic personality, both vulnerable and belligerent, comic and tragic, and above all, heroic, as he comes to grips with perhaps the greatest disability a musician can suffer. No man's music is more universal. Few men's lives are more inspiring. In every sense but one, his modest height, he was a giant. Born in Bonn in 1770, the eldest son of a singer, Beethoven moved in 1792 to Vienna. There he had some lessons from Haydn and others, quickly establishing himself as a remarkable keyboard player and original composer. By 1815, increasing deafness had made public performance impossible and accentuated existing eccentricities of character. Beethoven did much to enlarge the possibilities of music and widen the horizons of later generations of composers. To his contemporaries, he was sometimes a controversial figure, making heavy demands on listeners by both the length and the complexity of his writing, as he explored new fields of music. During the Baroque period, the foundations were laid for the following 300 or so years of musical expression. The idea of the modern orchestra was born, along with opera, including the overture, prelude, aria, recitative, chorus, the concerto, sonata, and the modern cantata. The rather soft-grained viol string family of the Renaissance was gradually replaced by the bolder violin, viola and cello. The harpsichord was invented and important advances were made in all instrumental groups. Choral music no longer dominated, and as composers turned more and more to writing idiomatic instrumental works for ensembles of increasing colour and variety, so classical music gradually began to work its way into the very fabric of society. The Baroque era witnessed the creation of a number of musical genres which would maintain a hold on composition for years to come. Yet it was the classical period which saw the introduction of a form which has dominated instrumental composition to the present day: sonata form. If Baroque music is notable for its textural intricacy, then the classical period is characterized by a near obsession with structural clarity. Grandiose and glamorous, Baroque music stands alone, written to glorify the finest courts of Europe, in Italy, France, Germany, England, Austria, and even far-flung Spain. Its greatest composers, such as Vivaldi, Handel and Bach, had a fascinating cast of musical magicians, including Albinoni and Scarlatti. Their lives are as intriguing as their music. We find virtuoso performers who earned their bread and butter in the cathedrals of Europe, while keeping company with kings and queens and setting opera houses ablaze across the continent with their fabulous new music. The Baroque era is rich in musical detail of the time, set against some of the greatest events in history. The Italian composer and violinist Antonio Vivaldi was born in Venice in 1678, and after his ordination in 1703, embarked on an intermittent career in the service of the Ospedale della Pieta, an institution for the education of orphan, illegitimate or indignant girls. It was an establishment with a formidable musical reputation. His later career brought involvement in opera. As a composer, Vivaldi was prolific, with some 500 concertos to his credit, in addition to a quantity of works for the church and for the theatre. He left Venice in 1741, in the apparent hope of finding new patrons in Vienna, where he died shortly after his arrival in the city. The surviving church music of Vivaldi includes the well-known Gloria, in addition to a number of settings of psalms and motets. Johann Sebastian Bach belonged to a dynasty of musicians. In following inevitable family tradition, he excelled his forebears and contemporaries, although he did not always receive in his own lifetime the respect he deserved. He spent his early career principally as an organist, latterly at the court of one of the two ruling Grand Dukes of Weimar. In 1717, he moved to Cothen as court cablemaster to the young Prince Leopold, and in 1723 made his final move to Leipzig, where he was employed as cantor at the choir school of St. Thomas, with responsibility for music in the 5 principal city churches. In Leipzig, he also eventually took charge of the University Collegium Musicum and occupied himself with the collection and publication of many of his earlier compositions. Despite widespread neglect for almost a century after his death, Bach is now regarded as one of the greatest of all composers. Born in Germany in 1685, Handel studied briefly at the University of Halle before moving to Hamburg in 1703, where he served as a violinist in the opera orchestra and subsequently as harpsichordist and composer. From 1706 until 1710, he was in Italy, where he further developed his mastery of Italian musical style. Appointed cablemaster to the Elector of Hanover, the future George I of England, he visited London, where he composed the first London Italian opera, Rinaldo, in 1710 and settled 2 years later. He enjoyed aristocratic and later royal patronage and was occupied largely with the composition of Italian opera, with varying financial success until the 1740s. He was successful in developing a new form, English oratorio, which combined the musical felicities of the Italian operatic style with an increased role for the chorus, relative economy of production, and the satisfaction of an English and religious text. In London, he won the greatest esteem and exercised an influence that tended to overshadow the achievements of his contemporaries and immediate successors. He died in London in 1759 and was buried in Westminster Abbey in the presence of some 3,000 mourners. Tchaikovsky was a Russian composer whose works included symphonies, operas, ballets, and chamber music. Some of these rate amongst the most popular concert and theatrical music in the classical repertoire. Despite his musical precocity, Tchaikovsky was educated for a career as a civil servant. Against the wishes of his family, he pursued a musical career and entered the St. Petersburg Conservatory, from which he graduated in 1865. This formal Western-oriented training set him apart from composers of the contemporary nationalist movement, embodied by the Russian composers of the five with whom Tchaikovsky's professional relationship was mixed. Despite his many popular successes, Tchaikovsky's life was punctuated by personal crises and depression. Contributory factors included the loss of his mother through boarding school and her early death, his suppressed homosexuality, and the collapse of the one enduring relationship of his adult life, his 13-year association with the wealthy widow von Meck. His sudden death at the age of 53 is generally ascribed to cholera, but some attribute it to suicide. The seeds of the classical age were sown by a number of composers whose names are now largely forgotten, such as Schobert and Hohner, both Germans largely active in Paris. They were representative of a period which is variously described as Rococo or Galant, the former implying a gradual move away from the artifice of high Baroque. The latter an entirely novel style based on symmetry and sensibility, which came to dominate the music of the latter half of the 18th century through two composers of extraordinary significance, Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. As the classical period reached its zenith, it was becoming increasingly clear, especially with the late works of Beethoven and Schubert, that the amount and intensity of expression composers were seeking to achieve was beginning to go beyond that which a classically sized orchestra or piano could possibly encompass. The next period in musical history therefore found composers attempting to balance the expressive and the formal in music with a variety of approaches, which would have left composers of any previous age utterly bewildered. The youngest child and only surviving son of Leopold Mozart, Wolfgang Amadeus, was born in Salzburg in 1756. He showed early precocity both as a keyboard player and violinist, and soon turned his hand to composition. His obvious gifts were developed along with those of his elder sister, under his father's tutelage, and the family, through their indulgence of their then patron, the Archbishop of Salzburg, was able to travel abroad between 1763 and 1766, to Paris and to London. A series of other journeys followed with important operatic commissions in Italy. The following period proved disappointing to both father and son, as the young Mozart grew to manhood and was irked by the lack of opportunity and lack of appreciation of his gifts in Salzburg. A visit to Munich, Mannheim and Paris in 1777 and 78 brought no substantial offer of other employment, and by early in 79 Mozart was reinstated in Salzburg, now as court organist. Early in 1781, he had a commissioned opera staged in Munich for the Elector of Bavaria. Dissatisfied after being summoned to attend, his patron, the Archbishop in Vienna, dismissed him. Mozart spent the last 10 years of his life in precarious independence in Vienna, his material situation not improved by a marriage imprudent for one in his circumstances. Initial success with German and then Italian opera and series of subscription concerts were followed by financial difficulties. In 1791, things seem to have taken a turn for the better, despite the successor to the Emperor Joseph II, who had died in 1790, lacking interest. In late November, however, Mozart became seriously ill and died in the small hours on the 5th of December. As he lay dying, Mozart was joined by his friends to sing through parts of a work that he'd left unfinished. This was his setting of the Requiem Mass, commissioned by an anonymous nobleman who had intended to pass off the work as his own. The Requiem was later completed by Mozart's pupil, Süssmayr, to whom it was eventually entrusted, although other possible completions of the work have since been proposed. In addition to a smaller number of works for vocal ensemble, Mozart wrote concert arias and scenes, some of them for insertion into operas by others. The Romantic era was the golden age of the virtuoso, where the most fiendishly difficult music would be performed with nonchalant ease, and the most innocuous theme in a composition would be developed at great length for the enjoyment of the adoring audience. The emotional range of music during this period was considerably widened, as was its harmonic vocabulary and the range and number of instruments which might be called upon to play it. Music often had a program or storyline attached to it, sometimes of a tragic or despairing nature. The next 100 years would find composers either embracing wholeheartedly the ideals of Romanticism or in some way reacting against them. With the honourable exceptions of Brahms and Bruckner, composers of this period shared a general tendency towards allowing their natural inspiration free rein, often pacing their compositions more in terms of their emotional content and dramatic continuity rather than organic structural growth. This was an era highlighted by the extraordinarily rapid appearance of the national schools and the operatic supremacy of Verdi and Wagner. The eventual end of Romanticism came with the fragmentation of this basic style, composers joining schools of composition, each with a style that was in vogue for a short period of time. Frédéric Chopin was a pianist-composer par excellence. Regarded as one of the most mesmerizing performers of his day, he lives on in his music. His life from his birth in Poland, his famous affair with the French writer George Sand, to his death at the age of 39 in Paris, features prominently in his music. Born near Warsaw in 1810, the son of a French emigrant and a Polish mother, Chopin won early fame in the relatively limited circles of his native country before seeking his fortune abroad in Paris. His departure from Warsaw coincided with the unsuccessful national rising against Russian domination, and Chopin found himself in Paris in the company of a number of other Polish exiles. He was able to establish himself as a pianist and as a teacher of the piano, primarily in fashionable society. His compositions, principally for the piano, make a remarkable use of the newly developed instrument of the time, exploring its poetic possibilities. As a young musician embarking on a career as a pianist, Chopin provided himself with half a dozen works for piano and orchestra, a form for which he later found no necessity. Delfina Potocka, a Polish countess, was a friend and muse to Chopin and Zygmunt Krasinski. Potocka's friendships with Chopin and Krasinski are immortalized in their correspondence and in numerous works that the two artists created in her honor, including poems by Krasinski and Chopin's famous Minute Waltz. Chopin met the novelist George Sand at the Hôtel de France, but he did not take to the dark, dignified and cold Sand. However, on December 13, he invited her to attend a soirée he was giving. He and Liszt played and George Sand smoked a cigar. Chopin was both fascinated and repelled by her outspoken beliefs, and the two later became interested in each other. Gossip about their relationship, however, made living in Paris more difficult, and they decided on a trip to Mallorca and its warmer climate. The islanders did not accept the sojourners, and this was probably the beginning of the end of the relationship. Chopin's possessiveness and jealousy did not help, and although they remained together for several years, the end came after Sand published Lucrezia Floriani, a thinly disguised account of their affair. Jane Stirling was a Scottish amateur pianist who is best known as a student and later friend of Chopin. Two of his nocturnes are dedicated to her. She took him on a tour of England and Scotland in 1848 and took charge of the disposal of his effects and manuscripts after his death in 1849. While there is no evidence that they were lovers, she was often referred to after Chopin's death as Chopin's widow. Chopin had told Jane Stirling that she was the only one who knew his true date of birth. She wrote it down and placed it in a box, which is buried with him in Père Lachaise Cemetery. On the first anniversary of his death, she scattered over Chopin's grave some Polish soil that she had obtained from his sister. On the 15th of October 1849, when his condition took a marked turn for the worse, his numerous visitors were asked to leave. He asked Delfina Potocka to play sonatas. On the 17th of October, after midnight, the physician leaned over him and asked whether he was suffering greatly. "Not anymore," Chopin replied. He died a few minutes before 2 o'clock in the morning. Man is a fortunate species. Over thousands of years, our intelligence has given us tools and technology, art and science, society and civilization. We now possess a treasure house of man's great achievements.